I'll start. So my name's Daniel Maines. I am on the executive committee for the Center for Peace and Development. It's connected with the Security and Context Network here at the University of Oklahoma. And I'm really excited to be with a new faculty member in the Anthropology department here at the University of Oklahoma, Darcie DeAngelo. And she does some really fantastic research that we'll be talking about today. She holds a PhD in anthropology from McGill University. She was recently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention in Binghamton University. And she is the author of the currently in process manuscript, Beloved Technologies on Bombs and Rats in a Cambodian Minefield, that is connected with a special series at the University of California Press. And so we'll be talking a lot about that manuscript as well as some of her other projects. So she's involved in a lot of really exciting projects. Probably we actually won't be able to get to all of them today, but I wanted to maybe start with, you could just tell us a little bit about, for those of us who don't know a whole lot about minefields in Cambodia, if you could just tell us a little bit more about that and how you came to this really interesting topic.
Sure. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm happy to be here. So the minefields in Cambodia is one of the most densely mine contaminated areas of the world. Landmines have been planted there throughout the 1970s. During the civil wars there was a genocide from the Khmer Rouge, which was a Maoist communist regime from 1975 to 1979. But most of the landmines that were planted there were planted by the government that overthrew the leader of the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot, in order to prevent the invading Khmer Rouge forces from entering the country. So that's on the northwestern region of the country. This is called the K5 belt. It was meant to act as what was called a bamboo wall against the guerrilla forces. And from 1985 to 1989, millions of landmines were planted there. So there's the estimate range of landmines in the K5 belt is 7 to 10 million landmines. And this is in a strip of land that's 1,024 kilometers or 650 miles and has over 1,000 landmines per linear mile. So it's a quite contaminated place. And that's actually where I did my master's degree work. And so my master's degree work was in the villages of the K5 belt, where I learned how people who had been affected by mines, so usually amputees or the families who had lost like people in their household because of landmines, and how they coped with it. And so this was really interesting work, but I found that fieldwork quite repressive because you can't walk anywhere. So I became really interested in the people who can walk on the minefields. So I started to research for my doctoral work minefield detectors or landmine detectors, and that led me to the animals who help people detect landmines, such as dogs. And I was lucky enough to be in Cambodia during the first implementation of the landmine detection rat there. And that was in 2015, 2016. And that's where I spent most of my field work for my doctoral work. And I've continued to maintain connections with the landmine detection rat platoons of deminers. And they detect landmines by scent detection, which is really important when it comes to landmines, because landmines nowadays are plastic. So a lot of minefields are filled with plastic, minimal metal mines, which means that they need scent detectors or something that can detect TNT, because usually when you use metal detection, it's less effective. So using scent detection is a better method for this kind of minimal metal mine. And that's what most of the landmines in Cambodia are. They're these like little plastic discs about the size of a fire alarm or smoke alarm that you'd see on the ceiling. And they're very lightweight and they move around during the rainy season. So they're hard to predict. The minefields also shift and move shapes. So the rats and the dogs are very effective tools for finding these landmines. And I studied the implementation process of this rat as a landmine detector.
Wow, yeah, that's fascinating. Just one quick question, follow-up question. Just in terms of the number of people that are impacted by these landmine fields, I mean, do you have a rough estimate of, maybe you said this, of how many people are living in areas where there's a heavy density of landmines, and how many people have suffered injuries from landmines?
Yeah, so Cambodia has the highest population of amputees in the world because of landmine accidents. It's about it's 11,000 people, I think, which is not a huge number in terms of the population of Cambodia. But the people affected most are the people who are living in rural areas, and I think they have a population of 10 million right now, and the 74% of those people live in rural areas at the outskirts of the country. The Cambodia itself is extremely mine ridden, so not just in those areas that I'm describing where the K5 belt is, but they just affect a lot of rural life. They not only cause accidents to people, but they also prevent cultivation of different lands. So it's dangerous to use this land where they can farm, but it's often the land that most poor people can use because it's non-taxable. They basically, the government incentivizes poor people to use minefields for cultivation. And then there's in the northwest. Sorry, I have a map of Cambodia, so I'm like trying to like map it out in my head. It's right behind me. But in the northwest, you have mostly mines, anti-personnel and anti-tank mines, which are the things that are set into the ground and triggered by a footstep, and then they explode. For the anti-tank mines, they're only affected by large vehicles such as tractors. In the southeast and in the east, it's not landmines so much as the bombs that were dropped during the Vietnam War by the U.S. So the U.S. had a massive bomb campaign against the Vietnamese in Southeast Asia and indiscriminately dropped bombs all over the countries here in that area. And a lot of the military waste in that area of the country are not landmines, but bomblets and like different cluster munitions that have dropped onto the ground, and those explode in less predictable manners. They explode as they decay. So you'll find like missiles or cluster bombs or bomblets, and they can just explode kind of whenever you're walking in the area. So there is like, however, more cultivation in that area because they're less dangerous than for like, everyday walking. So there's like, good coffee plantations there and rubber trees and things like that in that area.
Wow, I mean, that just must be a constant source of stress in terms of just thinking about those landmines and
Yeah.
monitoring where one is walking. And that's very interesting too, what you're saying about just the almost government incentives to encourage people to cultivate areas that may have mines, and the way that works to kind of disproportionately spread out the risks of encountering the mines.
Sure. Yeah. Like it's almost like someone described it to me as like human demining, which is not a great way to describe it. But the interesting thing about that is like, I think about in the terms of everyday life of risk in Cambodia. A lot of people are also very worried about malaria and mosquitoes. So there's also like, and there's lots of risks, and there's some research to indicate that landmines have become embedded in the idea of the environment there as well. So thinking through what it means to be a person living in this wilderness, they think about the mines as like a part of the wilderness, and something that is like just a part of cultivating land, which is interesting, right? Because you have to remove the mines to actually clear the land. And there's a lot of like do-it-yourself demining there, which is really interesting. Another interesting aspect of living in minefields in Cambodia.
Just people learning the skills or to do that by themselves, and imagine maybe some expertise develops in that as well.
Yes, yeah. One of the biggest NGOs in demining that's not connected to the government is called the Self-Help Demining Group, and it's a group of villagers who have learned how to demine from a former soldier. That being said, a lot of Cambodian people have military experience because of the amount of civil wars. So um, many people will have the kind of military skill sets that translate to demining.
Mm.
So a lot of them are familiar with mines and bombs based on their rural experiences of being conscripted to different sides of wars from 1975 to 1990s.
Okay, yeah, so that people can actually get, is that then a source of income then, or people will hire out to do some of this demining and,
It's not really a source of income. They can
yeah,
sell the mines for scrap metal. It's mostly a
yeah,
way to prepare the land so that they
okay,
can
yeah.
grow it.
Well, yeah,
Sometimes
but
people,
I guess
sorry.
what I mean is people hiring, like you could hire somebody to demine your land for you if you wanted to do that, as opposed to working through the government or NGO to demine the land.
Well, I mean, every NGO has to have a connection to the government
I see. Yeah.
in Cambodia and Southeast Asia. This is a sort of typical of the policies in these smaller states. So Laos and Cambodia and Thailand and Vietnam all have connection. Every NGO has to have an alliance with the government, and they reinforced that recently with a new law that basically just said the same thing as the old law, which is that every NGO has to comply with Cambodian state rules about um, the way they conduct their activities. So NGOs, even that self-help demining group, has connections to the government because they are unable to operate without them. So you do a baseline survey with the government, and if you do a baseline survey, you have to kind of somehow interact with state officials. So it's
Mm.
hard to do things as an individual, like private property owner, especially since most of the people are who living on uncleared minefields are unable to actually, they don't actually own the property, right?
Mm.
They actually are there to cultivate the land because um, they are renting from some landlord. So it's unlikely that you're able to. I mean, of course, if you're rich enough, you could probably clear your own minefield, but it's not usual for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Interesting. I mean, one of the things that I was fascinated about just in the title of the manuscript that you're working on is this notion of beloved technologies.
Yeah.
And I know that that refers specifically to rats. And but are you also thinking about bombs? Because that's also in the title of the manuscript as a beloved technology. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about just how you're thinking about beloved technologies and why why there's so much, I guess you could say, these kind of affectionate ties with these technologies.
Yeah, I'm interested in thinking about these. So yeah, bombs and rats as a kind of different kinds of persons or connectivity to persons in ideas like cosmic logics of the place of Cambodia, but also in just like thinking through like the way that you understand distributed agency through a bomb that actually is like the agency of the soldier. This is from Alfred Gell's work on distributed agency, where actually the actions of a soldier who might even be long dead. So it's a kind of like legacy, a ghostly legacy in the country, and how so the bombs are beloved because it's sort of a play also on like how I learned to love the bomb, but it's also a way of thinking through like what can the bombs be, and so they represent to some people ideas of protection or spirits and the way that spirits wield power in Cambodia, and also these kinds of ghostly histories of former soldiers who
Mm.
now are part of being are like now becoming part of the spirit realm in Cambodia. So there's a lot of soldiers that people are dreaming about, that people see in the minefields that need to be appeased, and that also can wield the bombs as places as power. And they also like they become part of this like potent places that another anthropologist has written about, and Yvonne Guillou, who where like actually the bombs become part of these like potent places. Um, the other thing, the rats, it's a much more clear way of thinking through a technology that can be beloved because while they are called a technology, they are also like called beloved by the Cambodian deminers who worked with them. And so as they were being implemented, Cambodians learned to love these rats, and they use this particular word metta to describe this love. And this love was, I was told, a kind of love that can turn a cruel person kind. So this love, metta, is a word that people use in Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism. It's like associated with the earliest for the kind of love a woman has for her unborn child. And I was told that it's this woman, if she walks into a forest and she's pregnant, she loves her unborn child so much that any animal who sees her will also feel love. So they'll feel metta. And this love is kind of this dispersed love that can affect everyone within its vicinity. And this had a particular valence for the Cambodian deminers who were literally working with their former enemies. So when you're working on a minefield in a platoon of deminers, you're a former soldier often, and you're working with other former soldiers who may have been conscripted to opposing sides in your past. And so you have this kind of history of conflicting armies on a single platoon. And so when people use this word love for the rats, it's a kind of metta love that can turn a person who might be cruel kind to you, right? So there's a kind of difference. This love was like not just about the rat, but also about each other, also about the team working on the minefield with each other.
Do you see that just playing out in the people's interactions with the rats in terms of just when you have these deminers and I mean, you see it with humans interacting with dogs, for instance,
Sure.
On the streets, people bond over petting a dog and talking about it. Were similar dynamics at play with rats in that sense of kind of bridging or developing relationships through them?
Absolutely. I mean, it was really interesting because even the choreography of the minefield altered considerably with the rat. So when you were normally on a minefield, it was a very singular, individualized activity where you sweep a metal detector in front of you and you look straight at the ground and you pay attention to the tedious work of demining. For the landmine detection technique with the rats walk between two deminers who are attaching themselves to the rat and to the other deminer with a piece of string. So then they step in unison. So they're forced to confront the rat and also each other as they walk along the minefield. And what's interesting about that is like the rat becomes a subject of jokes, action, and the rat, this one rat in particular, his name was Isaac. And one of my demining friends, one of my interlocutors, Malen, she would always call him little sister, and he was like a massive, huge rat. And she would call him, and she would just tap on her thigh, and he would follow her, and she was like, "Come here, little sister, come here." And this rat became a way for her to show affection to her suitor, and her suitor was like, so he was like, there was this joke. Someone was like, "Oh, we have a love story going on. He loves her." And when I asked her, she was like, "Oh no, I don't like feel anything special about him." But then I noticed that he would hold the rat, Isaac, and then she would like kiss the rat really close to his shoulder, which was like very close for a heterosexual couple to be in public. And then she would post a picture of herself on Facebook with the rat on her shoulder. Like she has this one picture where the rat kind of like makes it looks like her hair is like kind of like spreading, but it's actually just the picture of the rat. And he wrote down "beautiful sisters" underneath it. So it was like a way for him to show affection to her through Isaac, even though like Isaac is this like giant male rat, and she knew that he was a giant male rat. She just said, "I just feel like he's my little sister because I love him." And so she loved the rat, and for sure, but this love for Isaac was also a way that she showed affection for the suitor. And I left the field, and sure enough, next time I like checked up with them on Facebook, they were married. So they did get this was a love story, and the way they expressed affection was through this rat as a carrier, like a mediator of that affection.
Wow, that's an amazing story. That's really fantastic. And one of the things that you've written about, we're kind of building on that, is the way that rats can kind of play a role in people's perceptions of the state and to some extent legitimizing the government. How does that process work? How is that similar or different to what you're describing in terms of the more kind of personal human-to-human intimate relationship?
Yeah, it has like a different,
Hmm.
uh, it performs something different for the soldiers, the former soldiers. So there's a huge mistrust of most deminers
Oh,
among villagers in Cambodia. So APOPO, the NGO that does the landmine detection rat technique, tries to specifically tries to demilitarize the appearance and the methods of demining in Cambodia. And in all their demining activities, they work in Africa as well. And they try to promote materials of the rat because the rat itself doesn't really lend itself to being a militarized soldier. So you
mhm.
have the dog, and the dog is like this beautiful Belgian Shepherd dog, but it only interacts with one or two deminers. It always sits at attention and has these like spiky ears, kind of wolf-like, with this like narrow nose, and it's like a very stately, militaristic looking dog, a very noble looking creature. Whereas you don't really get that with a rat. A rat has its own kind of connotations, of being a pest, or it can be cute, right? So that's really the way the NGO decided to go in terms of the promotion of its materials, but it also affects the way that villagers see the deminers, because instead of seeing this like uniformed soldier, first of all, the NGO workers wear T-shirts now, so they actually also like change the uniform, but they also like carry these like rats with them on their shoulders, and the rats are snuggling with them. So you like see somebody tilt their head and like snuggle with the rat, which is a completely different kind of appearance, that has the potential to increase state legitimacy, I think, but I'm not sure it's quite there yet, right? Because there's other kinds of legacies associated with demining that are less about the appearance of soldiers or the promotional materials of any NGO, and more to do with the actual consequences and the unintended consequences of what happens with the land release step in demining.
Okay, yeah. So we just the last thing you said, the unintended consequences of the land release.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say a little bit? Was that what you were referring to earlier about that process?
Yeah. So what happens in demining is that the land is supposed to, after a minefield is cleared, it's supposed to go back to the villagers who
Uh,
originally cultivated it. But in a lot of cases in Cambodia, landmine clearance leads to land grabbing, and
yeah.
because it's a quite easy transition. So basically, you force people off the land to clear the minefield, and then you coerce them into giving the land to the government, or to a corporate, which usually leads to corporate interests. So what happens in the process of demining is that people associate the deminers with the state, and then for better or for worse, there's consequences to demining sometimes where the land release doesn't go to them, and then they end up um, confirming their suspicions that deminers are really just military police officers and working for the state, and continuing the legacy of land grabbing, which
Mhm.
is this kind of legacy of the Khmer Rouge as well, since land was taken from the people and then given back, but not given back and appropriately in all cases. And then you have this the redistribution of, and then even further like redistributing back to the government once development goals start to occur. So this pushes people off the land after minefield clearance.
What are some examples of, so when you talk about land grabbing, about how that land would be used? What sort of projects would that land be devoted towards?
Well, I mean, one minefield that I went to that was being cleared because the king had decreed the area as something, as a priority place
Mhm.
for development, and it was a road that was being built to the border, um, for the development of a casino, because there's a
Okay.
lot of East Asian tourists and Thai tourists who go to Cambodia for casino gambling and that kind of resort, and they're popping up all over the border, but the government wants to make it easier to get to there. So we were in this place where the school was halted and these trees were being cut down, and I was with a deminer, and he was like looking at the birds, and he was like, I wonder where these birds are going to go after we clear this minefield. And and then like there were just people staring at us on this from the side of the road, and I was like, well, I wonder what's going to happen to the people, because they're essentially being pushed off those villages for the construction of roads and infrastructure for development projects, which are seen in Cambodia's best economic interests.
Yeah, I mean, for in a casino like that, who usually owns a casino? Where's the investment coming from for the construction of a casino like that?
Usually China has a lot of investment in that, or there's also, I mean, wealthy Cambodians in the elite of Southeast Asia also have those kind of deals are usually from foreign investors mostly, but then also sometimes the elite class of Southeast Asia.
Yeah, right. And so this is one of those situations where the idea is, clear the land and use it in casinos. What were other examples of sort of money generating projects or revenue generating projects that would typically be put in place in some of these places?
Those are the examples that I've seen,
Yeah.
because that was like quite popular. I mean, there's definitely other kinds of construction projects that are for like tourists and things like that, just connecting the land, because Cambodia mostly has a lot of dirt roads. So really trying to increase the infrastructure also affects the way that people live in those regions. And this is mostly in the Northwest, because the Southwest and Southeast have quite developed their industries, and in the Northwest and the Southeast and the Northeast have developed industries already of trade and like kind of black pepper, and they have these kinds of other kinds of plantation crops. And then the ones in the Northwest are mostly kind of like dependent on tourism, most of the people who live there are ethnic minorities who have like different subsistence strategies that depend on their traditional style of cultivation. But the ones that the government are interested in doing are like ways to get tourists more easily into the country, or get them from Siem Reap to the border, where they can like get some money from those kind of industries.
In terms of like local people that have been living in these spaces, working in these spaces that have been dangerous, and then the mines become cleared, is there any hope on their part of finding work in some of these new casinos or industries? Or are they pretty much expecting that they are going to be forced to move and try to find a livelihood elsewhere?
They're usually forced to move and find livelihoods elsewhere. A lot of the ones that are owned by like East Asian or like Chinese corporations, specifically, the way the Belt and Road Initiative works in that area is like usually they import Chinese workers. So that's how it works in those areas. Like even the people who are working on the roads are Chinese people. So they tend to employ their own their own kind of like nationalities, rather than, and not even like people who are Chinese Cambodians, but rather they have like migrants that are working there right now, on the roads and on the casinos and in the casinos. Whereas the Cambodians themselves, again, also with ethnic minorities, they have different languages, and they end up having to find service work, or they try to migrate to other areas where they could also find their own subsistence strategies. But what that ends up those usually end up being depleted because of development and global climate change. So there's a lot of like there's this issue where the global climate change and local development and then regional development are working in conjunction to really push these people out of their homes into trying to find service work in different countries, or being jobless and unable to find work.
So is there at all a sense among Cambodians that the presence of mines is protecting their livelihood at all by preventing these sort of developments, economic growth that is ultimately going to displace them? And do people talk about that in those terms at all?
Well, the problem is, like, I was so associated with the minefield platoons that it was difficult to get accurate opinions about what people thought. But I did know that when I talked to people who who are villagers and not connected to demining platoons, they would often say things. They thought that there was no difference between deminers and the police. So they really, and they understood them as being so they associated them with the police who attacked environmental activists at the border. So there was a series of environmental activists who were attacked and arrested, and one person was shot dead at the border of Cambodia in the early 2010s. And this is something that people associated with deminers as well as the military. So they don't see much difference between the soldiers of the Cambodian army and the demining platoons. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't want the landmines gone. They want the landmines gone because they want to be able to walk safely in their home. But they are not always they sometimes act afraid when they see deminers because they're not sure how it's going to go, because the uniform is essentially the same as the soldiers. Mm-hmm. And then they also tend to feel, I think they feel worried that they won't get their land back. Sometimes they get their land back, and if they do still, usually in land grabbing, you still need to sign something to sign papers over to the government. So if they have an advocate working with them, they're able to hold onto their land.
Okay, so there are some strategies that people are using to try to maintain control of their land. It's interesting. I mean, it's a really complicated case, that kind of post-conflict, in the sense that you've got that material remnants of war left that people are still grappling with, dealing with. And then at the same time, as that's leaving, it's sort of being replaced by this new regime of land grabbing, rapid economic growth that seems to exclude a large part of the population. Do you think, I mean, just in terms of lessons that can be learned just for peace building from the Cambodian case, and what are some of your thoughts on that and the way that this has played out, both the kind of the positive side with the use of rats? It sounds like there's a lot of, some things that are really great that are happening there in terms of removing the mines, developing relationships, improving people's sense of trust. But then on the other hand, there's this whole other kind of dynamic that's coming into play here as well.
So lessons to be learned. I mean, I think that there's something really interesting about the paradox of peacekeeping forces, where and it's very similar to demining, where there's, and this is like Hugh Gusterson writes about this, where you're militarized, but even though you're in charge of a peacekeeping activity or disarmament. So and that itself doesn't necessarily actually exacerbates legacies of war and feels to people like just a continuation of the previous wars past. So I think there's the lesson to be learned is that not all peacekeeping forces are going to have a peacekeeping effect in terms of people's understanding of their relationship with the government, or with ideas of having compensation after war in a post-war regime. And the other thing is thinking about the fact that government corruption I mean, there's lessons to be learned is that there's when you have legacies of civil war, there's a vacuum of power, and then you have these people who are rising to power, and then you end up having continuous corruption. So I think that it's just it's not just the case in Cambodia, but I imagine it's a case in any place after civil war.
Definitely. Yeah. That's sort of just it's not just land grabbing, but it's power grabbing, any sort of capital, any sort of revenue, any sort of opportunity. And then that period of flux, chaos, different people kind of positioning themselves in order to take advantage of that, it sounds like. Mm-hmm. So in addition to your ethnographic work, you do a lot of work with different think tanks. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that, some of the work that you're doing there.
Sure. It doesn't feel like a lot of work. It feels like a very small aspect of work, but it's true. I am working with two think tanks on trying to provide some engaged work where I can offer some sort of policy recommendations to stakeholders about how to decrease the land grabbing that occurs after minefield clearance. And so thinking through what are some steps to put in place. And the other aspect that and then I've written one policy brief about the unintended consequences of gender mainstreaming that occurs. Gender mainstreaming is an incentive for NGOs in development to hire women, and the fact is that the way it's written, it depends on a binary gender construction, which excludes a lot of genders on the ground, especially in Southeast Asia, and can also kind of contribute to another legacy of previous harassment. So, for example, there was a person who was non-binary, or third gender rather, in one of the platoons that I saw, and they had to mark themselves down as a woman, and so there's a kind of misgendering that's incentivized even in NGOs that are global and aware of these kinds of issues, because they're incentivized to get the money from the gender mainstreaming policies. And then there's another aspect that I'm exploring, which is the ways in which that environment can be protected rather from minefields, by minefields, the way that minefields protect environments, which is really interesting because it does prevent cultivation. It does keep ethnic minorities in their subsistence strategies, rather than allowing for these massive corporate interests to pave roads over these grounds. So thinking through what are ways that we can allow for environmental protections. And this is parts of policies that are included in a lot of military waste decontamination. For example, in the United States, there's ways of thinking about military waste decontamination when it comes to nuclear waste, but also on sacred lands for Native Americans. And so those are aspects that are written into certain policies that can be written maybe more concretely into other policies that apply to other places, not just the United States, and ways of thinking about that. So those are some of the engaged work that I'm trying to provide as an ethnographer.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, it's really interesting. Do you ever find it challenging to take the work that you're doing as an ethnographer that's more qualitative based, you're dealing with some theoretically abstract concepts, and you mentioned distributed agency earlier, and then try to translate that into more of a policy, or at least something that can be communicated to folks that are coming at it from more of a political science or policy oriented background?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, yes, I think that there's something to be said for maybe not mentioning distributed agency when you're talking to a policy stakeholder, and more thinking through what are the problems and solutions. And that's a very difficult thing for anthropologists to do, because we tend to like to allow for possibilities of thought and not think about closing down ideas with solutions. And so I think it's just a matter of sort of reframing yourself so that you can tell the stories, because I think that the one thing I've found is that the ethnographic story itself, ethnographic stories really show how policies play out in the ground in a way that a lot of policy, political scientists or policy makers, are unaware of. And so having those concrete, grounded examples that you know from your research have a saturation of results, that you actually know is a pattern that you witnessed from in-depth fieldwork, is really helpful for people to understand what are the consequences of policy and what are issues that need to be resolved through policy. And I think the difficulty lies in really the divisions that we reinforce through our own jargon sometimes. Thinking through distributed agency to a policymaker is not going to be fun for them or necessary, but talking about how bombs are connected with ideas of spirits would make sense. It's a way of translating that story to somebody who hasn't read the anthropologists that you read.
Right. Well, yeah, and that's great. It sounds like you're really thinking through those things too, and I guess that is one of the things. As another anthropologist, that we need to think about is the multiple conversations that we're engaged in. That we are engaged in conversations with other anthropologists that are interested in these issues, that read these same things, but we also want to connect and communicate with folks that haven't read this, but are also, that could understand the way that a bomb and a spirit might be connected, and that is going to have kind of policy impacts, perhaps that could, I don't know, maybe connecting with the preservation of the ecology or the environment
Exactly.
as well. I'm guessing that, I mean, spirits are also part of that, the forest maybe, or I
Yes.
mean, I don't,
Yeah, they are. Yes, of course.
yeah,
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Because we always think, I think anthropologists don't realize that we have such great stories and people
right,
are interested in them. And then because we're interested in the stories too, but then we're
yeah,
like, we are also interested in how people think and what it means. And I think that um, that might be less interesting for people outside who are really trying to think through what kind of like structures they need to put in place to organize things. And I think that's just like that's something anthropologists do all the time. It's just
yeah,
that a matter of thinking through translational research, anthropology as translational research, and also thinking through science communication. So it's really those two, and it's not just anthropologists that need to do that. It's really like every single person working in social sciences or
mhm,
even the hard sciences. They also think about translational research and science communication. Those are really important acts of distribution, acts of sharing our work and our results that I think are really beneficial to everybody.
yeah, yeah. And thinking about communication, I mean, another one of the cool things that you do is a lot with video.
Yeah.
Where do you see that kind of fitting into the various, I mean, the policy work, the ethnographic writing? I know you do some more, I guess, different types of nonfiction writing as well. I don't think we'll get into it in detail, but you told me before about this amazing book about rats that you're working on as well that goes beyond your research in Cambodia. But where do you see video fitting into all this?
So I think of video as a data collection and data distribution tool. So it's true like in an outcome research. So it's like it's a tool of analysis because especially because when you're trying to capture things that cannot be said, really you do depend on things like sensorial encounters,
Mm,
right? So how do I know that the rat acts as a mediator between two people of love? Well, I have to like have like a moment where people are snuggling with rats or people are touching the rat, and I have to see how the rat feels too. So that is not something the rat is going to be able to tell you. So really the camera works as a way to collect that, and it's also a way to put things together and allow things to emerge. So when you have like thinking through saturations of results, right? This is a thing that we think about in qualitative research, is right, finding like a saturation, finding a pattern. Um, when you have images that you can look through, the images allow for saturation of a different sort from the testimonies of people, right? So you can allow them to interact with each other and think through, okay, what does this mean? And so I have like one moment where I saw this piece of this picture of one of my films where a woman is like carrying a rat on her shoulder, and it's like you can see through it, and it looks like the rat is her head for like a moment in the film. And then that made me think about another artist who's a Cambodian artist who portrays these like hybrid creatures of stars and people and technologies and people. So like a woman with a TV for her head, or like a person, like a person's body who has like this bouquet of flowers for her head, and with alongside human beings. And this is like a famous artist in Cambodia working from different Theravada Buddhist cosmic logics, thinking through the sosai, which are these like threads that connect people and not and like other living creatures. And it's these spiritual threads or veins that connect people that are part of rituals. And then it made me realize that the string that Cambodian deminers use also like sort of references that or alludes to that kind of idea of string that might have like this valence in the cosmic logic for the Cambodian deminers that I wouldn't have been able to see without understanding it through the images that I have to review. And then one way you can portray that is by doing a montage of those images and allowing people to come to that conclusion as well and showing them the saturation of those results. And so for me, sensory ethnography and visual anthropology are all ways to explore those encounters between humans and non-humans, and references to other kinds of imagistic traditions that that open up ways of understanding that you can't always get from a testimony, that you can't always get from an interview. So it's helpful for those cases. And I also think, like, I'm not going. My Cambodian interlocutors are not going to read anything I write because they don't read English that well, and so but they'll look at a video of themselves and enjoy it. And so one of the ways that I tried to give back to them is by like printing out all these like screenshots for each of them of themselves, and I like some of them liked them and some of them didn't, because like some of them had their legs cut off and they were upset about that. So I ended up being upset. I was like, you make mistakes all the time in anthropology, but there's like the videos are such an important way of giving back to my interlocutors. And part of the way that they interact is also with pictures online, and this is just like a way that people communicate these days. So it's another aspect of conducting ethnographic field work. At least for me, this is something that I appreciate about it's the way it helps me think better about my field site.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, one of the things I find so interesting about that is that you describe video as almost enhancement for the ethnographer, for the researcher, in terms of things that your memory can't fully capture, things that your senses can't fully capture. And so it becomes a way of reviewing things. But then what I also like about it is that it's not just that, it's also a way of presenting that information. And the same way that you see things become as a montage, someone's presenting it, it allows you to put those two ideas, to juxtapose things together, to show relationships and connections that you can certainly do through writing, but it's hard to do that in such a direct way, to put them right next to each other. And like some of those connections that you're describing are just, those are all very fascinating, rich things that it's so hard to kind of, to write that out is to lose some of that, the immediacy of it, I feel like. And so definitely what we'll do, I think, with this interview is obviously we'll put a link to your website where people can access those videos directly to get just a sense of that. And I haven't looked at all of them, but the ones I have seen, just there is a really nice kind of sensory dimension there that certainly is very evocative of some of the things that you've been discussing.
Thanks, I appreciate that. Yeah, I haven't had that much time to really edit a good film together. So like, right, what you see now are these like rough cuts, or one of them is like an example of in a montage exhibition that I did for Feverish Worlds conference at the University of Vermont. And it's like this, like everyone had these tents where they had their own little kind of like exhibits. It was a really interesting conference. And I did these like a projection of a montage of different human animal relationships, and called them according to like what we think of as human concepts. So like peace, karma, and food. And so you had like the peace was the landmine detection rat, and the karma was the bird that gets released for merit in Cambodia. So you get to release, if you release an animal back into the wild, it gets you get merit. But there's this story that actually when you capture the bird, you weigh it down with all these perfumes and oils, and then you send it out, and then the little boys who are like trying to get money will like go and capture that same bird after it falls into the water and put it back in the cage. So what's happening is like a recycling of these birds who just get released for merit, which is like a bit disturbing. And it's so interesting to see the fear in the bird's eyes that really reveal a different story about karma than we think of when we think about, oh, you release a bird for merit and for good luck. It's like, and so the bird is like in the person's hand is a close up of the bird, and you can see its inner eyelid like close and then open. And it's like the poor thing is like so terrified. And then the food is the cattle. And so it's like interesting to see the animal experiences of those human concepts, and what are the greater relationships in those human, like what we think of as human concepts, when they're actually also really important to the animals too.
Right, right. And yeah, I think that's also highlights another thing that you pointed out, that you can't interview animals, and yet the animals, but they're they're fascinating. They are, I don't want to anthropomorphize too much, but they're evocative. There's something going on there that you can see visually or through sound that video takes us to. And so to see the reaction, the way that animals are reacting is very important to this. Yeah, yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to anthropomorphize them, but we also don't want
Yeah,
to like be human exceptionalists.
sure. Yeah.
So there are like, of course, we can see fear in an animal,
Uh,
and you can see what maybe they are feeling when it comes to thinking through. When the landmine detection rat is struggling in her harness, she's not happy about being in it, and she is happy when she's like eating a banana. So it's like you can tell those things, and I think that
right.
there's something, but you can tell those things through video because you can't really tell them through the rat telling you something.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's no direct quoting or anything. I mean, you can
Exactly.
describe the rat appeared happy, but it's, yeah, what does a happy rat look
Well, and
like?
I think I don't want to like dismiss textual
Yeah.
ethnographies. I think
Sure.
we can do all of this with writing as
Mm.
well. It's just that you have to write sensorially if you want to do that, and imagistically. So in some sense, it's still a sensory ethnography when you are writing and describing and depicting those moments.
Yeah. 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 And I think that that's what I really appreciate about your work is that you're bringing all of these different elements together. I mean, you demonstrated some really interesting policy implications of the research, but then there's this sensory dynamic of really wanting to bring the reader or the viewer, whatever the case may be, to the study, to the evidence, to the material, to make those types of connections, and that the two are really very difficult to separate from each other, particularly when we're dealing with these kind of multi-species relationships, and not only multi-species, but also the sense of the past, the ancestors, ghosts,
Yeah.
spirits. There's a lot going on there. And so I really appreciate your ability to bring all that together and also talk about policy and make very concrete recommendations and engage with these think tanks and that sort of thing as well that are primarily occupied by a lot of political scientists and that sort of thing. So it's impressive that you're able to bring together so many different things with your work.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I mean, I try. I think we all have those stories to tell, and I think those stories are like actually still very useful to policy makers. So like, even though I'm like, I have like, yeah, they seem like they don't overlap, but a lot of the ways that I tell the story to the policymakers is still going to incorporate some of these imagistic essences because that is something that most people understand or people can get like the policy ramifications through the concrete grounding. Of course, it's like also framed with like problems and solutions and policy statements. So that's like a different thing, right? It is a little bit difficult sometimes to transition.
Right, right, yeah. Well, wow, yeah. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to just talk about your research and everything that you're working on in terms of your output from the research. And looking forward to having you join in more conversations with the Center for Peace and Development and the Security in Context network. And for the listeners or the viewers, we'll be sure to put up the links to your website, anything else that you want to add to when we get this posted.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the conversation.